Castlevania on the Nintendo Entertainment System was one of the most memorable of the third generation. While clunky and brutally difficult in some areas, its setting of 1691 Transylvania filled with monsters was an epic adventure that set its mark as a classic on that console. However, the MSX port was different, featuring breakable walls full of keys and friendlies who offered purchasable items. Konami wanted to implement elements from both titles for the next one, avoiding the temptation of creating a sequel that felt the same, which is a common issue with most games today. Castlevania II Simon's Quest was released for the Famicom Disk System on August 1987, December 1988 in North America, and the rest of the world by 1990. Today, this game is extremely polarizing, but after reviewing the predecessor, I want to give it a chance, especially because Symphony of the Night is one of my all-time favorites, and it probably wouldn't have existed if the developers didn't try this kind of gameplay style before. After the success of the predecessor on the NES, the console itself turning the video game media into a legit moneymaker, and Konami becoming one of the most popular developers for that system, there was plenty of hype surrounding its sequel. It was even on the front cover of the second issue of the recently created Nintendo Power magazine. Looks awesome, right? Well, parents disagreed as Nintendo received multiple complaints over the cover claiming their children were having nightmares from it. Because it's Castlevania, I say mission accomplished. As far as I'm concerned, it matches with the game's plot. It does a better job than the text in the menu screen, which doesn't give you much of a chance to read it. 7 years after Simon Belmont defeated Dracula and destroyed his castle, he begins to feel sick, and monsters are invading the land of Transylvania. He was approached by a mysterious woman and told him that a curse was inflicted on him after defeating Dracula all those years ago, and death was inevitable. To remove the curse and defeat the Dark Lord once and for all, he needs to find all the pieces of Dracula scattered in all the castles of Transylvania. It doesn't make sense that someone who appeared and disappeared explaining everything. This is all according to the game's manual, but at least it has a plot unlike the first game. Discounting remakes, it's the last of the Simon Belmont era, because Dracula rises every century. And because it's set in Transylvania where Simon has to explore multiple castles instead of a giant one with a singular pathway full of enemies to try and slaughter, the gameplay takes a non-linear approach. The whole map is free for you to explore in any direction, with the occasional locked pathway and lots of equipment and sub-weapons to collect. Similar to Zelda or Metroid. I like that it took a risk by trying something different, and it was the right choice in the long run. However, the developers didn't do a very good job here. You start in the middle of the map in a town somewhere, and the first thing you do is buy a white crystal, a holy water sub-weapon, and a better whip. Fair enough. You get to explore different places with less restriction. Despite the non-linear structure, it feels like a Castlevania game, but maybe not at its full potential. While the music is as energetic as any other NES title, Bloody Tears in particular has become one of the franchise's most memorable songs. They repeat every 10 to 20 seconds. Every time I reach a castle, I mute the TV after 5 minutes because I got sick of it. It also has all the classic horror themes and inspirations, but it doesn't look as atmospheric. It could be because it's a bigger game, and the developers can only fit so much. But compared to the first Castlevania, it's not as detailed. These trees, for example, remind me of a tile wallpaper, and if there are too many enemies on screen, the slowdown is unbearable, and is especially apparent in some parts of the castle where even one enemy slows it down. What happened here? And I'm using the NES Mini to play this, so the system isn't to blame. After finding the first castle going east, not west, because enemies are too strong there, I got an oak stake and possessed the first Dracula part. Oh, I'll get to that. Okay, now I don't know. I found another town and accidentally traded the white crystal for a blue one without any explanation. Then later on I found out it unlocked certain parts of the map. I initially thought there was a glitch where I was stuck because I didn't have a chance to do everything with the white crystal, but no. It's one of those items that unlocked extra parts while still allowing you to go back. That was the moment when I looked at a walkthrough, and I found out that the holy water can break through parts of these empty rooms and lead to purchasable items that are required for me to advance. So this is notorious for not properly explaining what it is that you're meant to be doing. Thanks to internet walkthroughs, it isn't much of an issue, but let's look at the basics first. Killing enemies earn you hearts, which are not only ammunition for more sub-weapons like the predecessor, but currency for purchasing equipment to help along the way, and gaining experience which increases your maximum health. There are no money bags or pork chops. Hearts are the ultimate item for everything. I wouldn't be surprised if it also affected the control mechanics, but it doesn't. Only a few tiny changes have been made here. Simon can take more damage and whip attack faster, however he still can't move in mid-air, and because the platforms require better timing, like this spot where you can hit your head on the block, these moving platforms, or just water hazards in general, at least half of these jumps require you to be on the razor's edge of a gap to make it without falling. A bit more platforming skill to get anywhere. So it has all the same control issues as the predecessor. However, it isn't a test in patience simply because enemies don't put up anywhere near as much of a fight. The whole journey is loaded with the same monsters and attack patterns with the occasional outlier, and they never increase in numbers. You won't be forgetting these skeletons anytime soon, which means apart from the holy water, which I'll get to, all the sub-weapons including daggers, diamonds and flames are pretty much useless. The whip does more than enough damage everywhere you go if you keep upgrading it throughout the journey. The only enemies that provide a serious challenge are the blobs, and the ones that fly from above because you can only attack in 2 horizontal directions. Though I'm not complaining this time because they're still easier to deal with than anything in the first Castlevania. Enemies become stronger at night when the shops are closed, so all you're doing is picking them off. And it's the video game equivalent of driving through a traffic jam in the middle of a giant city. Because there's nothing else to do if you're planning on buying whip upgrades, garlic or laurels. You have to wait for daylight to appear. Daylight is also just as monotonous, because to earn hearts, you pick it up from enemies, and that's it. Games of the action-adventure genre like these usually allow you to take quests or visit areas that might provide some sort of challenge, but enough to gain lots of experience and/or weapons, and farming is the last resort. Here it doesn't take as long to gather hearts as I initially thought, but since killing random enemies is the only way, don't be surprised if you turn this game off out of boredom. But the biggest reason why it feels like such a breeze is whenever you lose a life, you respawn right where you left off, even after a game over screen. However, the latter means you lose all your hearts, so if you're hunting for enemies, made a bit of progress, but go game over, it gets erased. Which means if you collect enough hearts for a desired item or sub-weapon, buy it ASAP. But at least there's an excuse to avoid dying. Think about it, if the game didn't take away your hearts, what's the point of lives or a health bar? I'm very surprised by how easy the combat is given how brutal the first game was. I would program it so that losing a life sends you back to the current area you started on, and the game over screen send you back to the latest town or castle you visited. It sounds similar to the checkpoint system in the first game, which I hated, yes, but the enemies in Simon's Quest are so pathetic that balances it out. Basically, I want something in between. There's also a password system so you don't have to beat it in one sitting, while the Famicom version has a save state. I don't know what's more tedious, putting in a password every time I want to resume where I left off, or wait for an area to load. This might be a reason why Nintendo stuck with cartridges for the N64. That's how slow these disc systems were. Thanks to the NES Classic Edition, all headaches are eliminated in that regard. The castles contain a part of Dracula that can only be possessed by throwing an oak stake at the crystal ball surrounding it. What else does it look like? And each castle has someone inside who offers you one if you pay up. Some of them have boss battles, if you want to call them that, with another crucial item to collect, and you literally don't have to move to beat them. Like the MSX predecessor, the castles are also full of invisible or breakable blocks that aren't indicated, but once you realize that all the castles are like that, and you have the holy water selected, you'll be fine, which explains why they don't cost hearts. Besides, this is considered linear and straightforward compared to the rest of the game. Simon's Quest is one of the most cryptic video games I've ever played for all the wrong reasons, and English localization is the most likely culprit. Whenever you talk to someone, at least 90% of the time it doesn't make sense. It could be because it's either poorly translated, poorly explained, or have nothing to do with the gameplay. I don't know if they were trying to be symbolic or metaphorical, forcing you to think about it. A magic potion will destroy the wall of evil. Couldn't they just say the holy water can destroy certain blocks in buildings? Seriously, talking to the townspeople is pointless. But then you need to just in case they have something you can purchase from them. There's a theory suggesting that the townspeople don't want you to bring back Dracula, and they're deliberately giving you bogus information to stop you. This quote, "After Castlevania, I warned you not to return," and words from producer Kouji Igarashi support this, inspiring him to avoid making the same mistake in Symphony of the Night. But imagine how much of a difference maker it would be if the text was proofread. It still might be a boring game, but at least I know what I was doing. You can't be this vague in an adventure game where information gathering is key. Otherwise, it instantly ruins whatever they were trying to accomplish. You need to walk through the whole game, and if that's the only way, what's the point? It takes away the sense of exploration, and you're just doing it by the numbers. And imagine living in 1988 playing this game without internet. If you didn't have the right Nintendo Power magazine, you'd be stuffed. It also doesn't help that there's no map system either. At first it isn't an issue because Transylvania is small for a non-linear game, but too many areas look the same, and split pathways can be misleading, like going underground to another town, unless going straight takes you to a cliff. I don't know. I could go on explaining all the key moments when I was stumped, but one epitomizes this game in a nutshell. After I traveled to the west end of the map using a red crystal to summon a tornado, which is a cryptic moment in itself, by the time I possessed Dracula's nail, the fourth part, I noticed a gap in the submenu, and the weapon I had wasn't strong enough to advance competently. I lost a lot of lives here and I didn't know what to do next. Everywhere I went felt like a dead end. After looking at a walkthrough, I found out that the tornado took me to the east side of the map. I unintentionally skipped a castle because I didn't have the Dracula heart selected while on this ferry. So to go back and make amends, I had to run through this long stretch of poisonous marshes to reach back to the castle and possess Dracula's eyeball, a sentence I never thought I'd utter, as well as upgrade the whip, which meant buying as many laurels as possible, and therefore more boring heart scavenging. It took me 3 attempts because the laurels run out quickly, all because of that one tiny mistake without any indication, and if there was, again, the townspeople would most likely be vague as usual. It's as if the developers thought of everything to make it as confusing as possible. I seriously thought for a while that I was permanently stuck and that was it. I understand that if you did everything, it's not a big deal, but if the text wasn't this appalling, I wouldn't be in this situation to begin with. After collecting all the pieces of Dracula and reaching the far east end of the map, Simon reaches what remains of Dracula's castle, tosses everything in place, and check this out. That's all it took to beat Dracula. Even on the outskirts of the final castle, there isn't a single enemy standing in your way, which kind of makes sense because everything was destroyed in the first game. If you somehow die, embarrassingly enough I did once, you have to walk through the entire castle again, so be careful. All I did was use a couple of laurels and that was it. The ending is based on how long it took for you to beat it. The one I got was the normal ending in which Simon died from his wounds, which doesn't make sense because who's that? And how did he get fatal wounds if he beat him so easily? Unless it had to do with the curse or the grind he suffered through to reach this far. And why is he paying respects to Dracula? It's such a mess, but at least it wasn't misspelt. The bad ending has no Simon, but the text appears as if he survived. Word is that like the townspeople, the developers messed this up too by having them swapped around. Why doesn't that surprise me? To get the best ending, which makes the most sense, you need to beat it in 7 game days, which can be done at least on the second try. On the first one, it only took me a few hours. Yes, I used a walkthrough, I admit it, but trust me, you won't get far without one. Say what you want about the difficulty of the predecessor, it was very satisfying to beat. Here, the elements that are supposed to be hard are too easy, and the parts that are supposed to be easy don't make sense. Not once did I think, oh, now I get it. The whole time I was like, what? How was I supposed to figure that out? And I feel like whenever I made progress without a walkthrough, it was by accident. That's why Simon's Quest feels like a chore. And if there are any positives, they can be found in other NES Castlevania titles anyway. But all that being said, I'm glad this game was made. I'm glad they tried something new. They had the mindset of more is better, and along with the MSX version of the first game, they created the prototype of the Metroidvania formula that would become a staple for the franchise's 5th generation and beyond. But to play now, it's a decent game ruined by its English localization, and I wouldn't recommend it. There are better Castlevania games to play.